my paper's entitled Walter Benjamin's Chess Turk and the Emancipatory Potential of Religion, the West and the Rest. And in Walter Benjamin's thesis on the philosophy of history, he offers a perplexing image. A mechanical puppet in Turkish attire with a hookah in his mouth, playing an expert game of chess. Benjamin writes, this automaton is, quote, constructed in such a way that it can win, that it can play a winning game of chess, answering each move of an opponent with a counter move, unquote. To the outside viewer, the expert chess-playing puppet is an enigma. How can an inanimate puppet outsmart a sentient chess player? Benjamin reveals that inside the table, underneath the chessboard, is hidden a small little hunchback who is the expert chess player. It is this hunchback who guides the hands of the Turkish automaton and wins over the opponents. For Benjamin, the image of the automaton Schach Turk, the chess Turk, which was invented by the German Wolfgang von Kempelen in the 18th century, provides a symbolic image for religion and theology in the 20th and now 21st century West, right? Whereas it explicitly appears that the Turk, understood to be Benjamin to represent historical materialism, is winning the struggle against the opponents, the Turk has secretly enlisted that little hunchback, here understood to be theology. It is theology who is the true genius in the struggle, and historical materialism is the mere facade. Representing theology, the ugly little hunchback must keep out of sight, for theology is taboo in a secular scientific society which no longer trusts religious utterances. For Benjamin, if theology is to engage in an emancipatory struggle again, it must do so through secular historical materialism. So in this brief essay, I would like to ask a couple of questions related to Benjamin's dialectical image. One, is this still true today, that theology must smuggle itself into historical materialism? And two, is that claim true for the Western world? So it's clear that Benjamin's dialectical image, that he sees a role for religion in it, or at least in theology, which struggles to emancipate human oppression. There's still a role for religion in that. A similar perspective was shared by the other members of the first generation of the Frankfurt School. However, for Benjamin, as well as Adorno, Horkheimer, Fromm, Löwenthal, religion's role in such an emancipatory project is not straightforward. They recognize the reality of the Western Sonderweg, as Habermas calls it, the deviant path, what Habermas calls the extreme level of secularization in the West, and the problem that causes for active religiosity. Of course, we all famously know God is dead, thus says Nietzsche, and all that is left is the secular life world with mild residues of religion remaining. Although these pockets of religion remain within the post-secular society, religiosity in the West is a mere shadow of its once self. That's not a controversial claim by any means. When I'm the secular philosopher sitting in Rome in the Chiesa Nuova, and I'm the only person in there, you know something's gone wrong, right? So the reality cannot be ignored by the critical theorist, and it will not be ignored by the Frankfurt School, but rather will reside at the core of their nonconformist social theory. So how does one square this round peg? How does one claim that religion has a role in emancipatory struggles and contemporary emancipatory struggles, while at the same time implying that religion is entirely impotent in a secular society? To answer that is our task. From the perspective of the first generation of the critical theory, those aspects of religion that are to survive secular modernity must go through the secularization process. Adorno sums up this claim in his essay entitled Reason and Revelation, writing, quote, nothing of theological content will persist without being transformed. Every content will have to put itself to the test of migrating into the realm of the secular, the profane. This migration of the sacred into the profane through determinate negation, wherein the sacred elements of religious semantics and semiotics are drained and transformed into publicly accessible reasoning, is the only way for religion and theology to remain within the struggle for emancipation for the non-identical in the secular Western world. That's the basic claim here. The nearly complete secularity of the West calls for such a drastic measure, as religion in its own skin appears anachronistic, obscurantist, and unable to defend its claims. Indeed, when it does attempt to defend its claims, it does so with the tools of secular modernity, ratio, reason, right? Thus tacitly acquiescing to the reality of secular modernity's already triumph over religion. This is a methodological departure in regard to religion from the Frankfurt School's immediate predecessors, including Feuerbach, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, and even Lenin, all of whom called for an abstract negation of religion in the West, as they thought religion remained a recalcitrant impediment, to the full actualization of man's potentials, psychologically, sociologically, politically. The Frankfurt School, rooted within the works of their predecessors, abandoned the abstract negation of religion in favor of a determinate negation of religion, wherein they would return to religion as a concept resource for nonconformist theology or philosophy. They did not want to collapse philosophy into positive metaphysics, which would abandon the hope that Golgotha, the history as Golgotha, would not be the last word for humanity, that the innocent victim would in some way triumph over their murderer. While it was not possible for them to retreat into religiosity, they attempted to maintain the negativity of apophatic theology, negative theology, within their own philosophy. In fact, it was the Bilderverbot, or the image ban, the Hebraic ban on images, that was translated into the concept of the political utopia in the Frankfurt School. That became the driving force, if you will, the core of their negative philosophy. So just as the Bilderverbot stood as the theological grand inquisitor to all that was elevated, all that elevated itself to divine status, whether that was an individual or nation, the notion of utopia served as the historical grand inquisitor against all ideologies that posited the end of history via their vision of an ideal society. The unarticulated utopia therefore served as ideology critique. In this way, the core theological ideas of Judaism, and of course in Islam as well, animates the secular philosophy of the Frankfurt School, just as the hunchback of theology animates the chess Turk in Benjamin's dialectical image. Where the Frankfurt School wrote about religion and theology, they did so during the Cold War context, wherein most major political struggles were being fought within the struggle between capitalism, socialism, communism. Even third world liberation struggles were pigeonholed into this binary. This overarching context, as well as their own commitment to certain Marxist perspectives, forced the Frankfurt School to sublate religion into historical materialism, for historical materialism itself, in all its various shades, was the primary force for social emancipation. Today, sadly, historical materialism is fairly weak. It is mostly an intellectual exercise among nonconformist scholars in various political parties, most of whom are politically impotent. Today, we're in what Jürgen Habermas has described as the post-secular society, wherein the secular Western nations have come to realize that religion has not disappeared, as Feuerbach, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, and Lenin had hoped it would. Religion remains an important force within secular society, albeit not a determining one. If historical materialism is no longer a force for historical and/or emancipatory change, and religion has demonstrated its capabilities of withstanding the onslaught of secular modernity, or even rebound due to the pathologies of secular modernity, ought we now think about reversing Benjamin's image? Ought the ugly little hunchback step out of the box and reveal itself as the true master chess player? In other words, ought historical materialism now be translated into theological language so that it may enter into the public discourse via religion? Now, bear with me. It's clear that Pope Francis, for example, is not a Marxist, even though he's often accused of being one, but he's not a Marxist. But Pope Francis's own critique of capitalism, the marginalization of the poor, the destruction of the planet, all core elements in historical materialism, has garnished him praise and admiration even from the most devoted of atheistic leftists. Whereas those same leftists most often preach to the crowd, Pope Francis, using explicit theological and biblical language, has brought together both religious and secular voices in his attempts to undermine global capitalism, sex trafficking as well, interreligious violence as well, and to turn the world's attention to the plight of the poor, the refugee, and those who have been left in the ditch of history. Certainly, the Vicar of Christ isn't advocating a revolutionary overthrow of the prevailing political economic system, nor is he going to transform the Catholic Church into a leftist utopia. But he need not be the only vehicle for historical materialist informed religious critique of secular capitalism, neocolonialism, and financial imperialism. But his religious voice is more powerful right now than any secular Marxist at the moment. Another example to consider were maybe, say, the Catholic liberation theologians, who also read the Gospels through the lenses of Marx's class analysis. They too determinately negated Marx and allowed certain elements of historical materialism to be translated into their religiosity, whereupon they critique their own well-entrenched institutions, specifically the Catholic Church, for being on the side of those with the largest battalions, as Napoleon once remarked about the church. Like Pope Francis today, these liberation theologians drew the ire of international capitalists who were invested in social statics that privileged capital and those who owned it over the wretched of the earth, whom the liberation theologians shepherded. With their own openness towards Marxist philosophy, historical materialism's influence within the Catholic Church and Catholic theology, returning the Gospels to the crucified, and not just Jesus of Nazareth, the heavenly Redeemer, as it's understood to be, but also return the Gospels to the very earthly persecuted, those who are oppressed and those who are degraded. After a period of conservative suppression, liberation theology moved the church away from the influence of Emperor Constantine, who reconciled Christianity to imperialist power in the 4th century, and set the stage for a class-conscious theology of Pope Francis. In such a way, the prophetic within Christianity was elevated over the priestly, and Christianity once again took on the revolutionary role it once had within the Roman Empire among the liberation theologians. While it is true that the post-secular condition that Habermas speaks of allows for religious voices to express their discontent with the condition of secular modernity, their voices are still marginalized. Thus, a metapolitical struggle within religious communities is needed, wherein the battle of ideas ought to attempt to bring religious voices back to the initiators of Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, all of which shared a critique of class domination, a la Marx, in their own time, albeit in religious language and with definite theological presuppositions. Nevertheless, it is time for both religious and secular thinkers, believers, intellectuals to think about how they can form united fronts against neoliberalism, class domination, exploitation, gender inequality, and other forms of tyranny with the understanding that their worldviews may not find an overlapping consensus on all matters, but can at least agree upon the claim that the world ought to be without such tyranny. Now, and this is the last section. In the 20th century, historical materialism not only determined much of the West, but was a major influence in the Muslim countries, especially those who were either under direct colonial control by Western countries, especially those nations in Africa, parts of the Middle East, and East Asia. In many of these countries, communist parties participated within their post-colonial governments, and in others, communism became the official ideology of the state. Nevertheless, Arab and Iranian nationalism, which often drew from Marxist sources in their emancipatory struggles, failed to bring about societies that were congruent with Marxist visions of classlessness. Their attempts to suppress religious voices in favor of secular socialist and/or nationalist voices ended without achieving the great emancipation they desired. As a result, the age of native dictators, as opposed to direct colonial control by Western nations, began. And until the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and later the Arab Spring, such an age found very little effective opposition. Here too, I argue that Benjamin's dialectical image can shed some light. It appears to me that in many cases, Islam was not sublated into secular forms of opposition to secular dictatorial states, but was rather suppressed as being somehow either one, supportive of the dictatorial state, or two, hopelessly obsolete, incapable of mounting any effective opposition. While the first claim has plenty of examples within Islamic history and Muslim history, the later is simply untrue, as was shown by the theorists such as Ali Shariati, who, like the liberation theologians, returned to the Shia tradition a consciousness partially formed by historical materialism and its various permutations. He did not follow Jalal Ali Ahmed and others into the Tudeh party, which was more aligned with Soviet-style communism, but rather determinately negated Marxism, the Frankfurt School, and others, and married their class analysis with the primordial Islam of Prophet Muhammad and the long tradition of struggle that has formed the Shia tradition. In this way, he reversed Benjamin's image. Shia Islam was the public image of opposition to systems of oppression, including US domination, the peacock throne of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi Shah, and the political quietism of the clerical establishment. This begs the question, can Islam in the 21st century be the public face of human emancipation within Muslim societies without regressing into reactionary forms of fundamentalism? Or is Islam so tied to its closed semantic universe, typical of religions under assault by secular modernity, that it cannot be influenced by secular emancipatory political theory? Can Muslims rooted within the Islamic tradition struggle for modern, democratic, and anti-capitalist societies, or must their visions of an ideal society end in authoritarian theocracy? While many progressive Muslims and modernist Muslim thinkers argue for the affirmative, most of the Islamic political parties that oppose Western hegemony do so through reactionary retreats into theologically and politically static forms of Islam, as not to sacrifice perceived authenticity for the incorporation of bid'ah or innovation. From my perspective, reactionary forms of political Islamism are doomed to fail, as they are anachronistic, romantic, and even nostalgic for an ideal past that they cannot recover. Such attempts to return to an earlier stage in Islamic history is rooted in psychological need, not a cold assessment of the modern world and the place of the Ummah within it. It appears to me that if the majority Muslim countries wish to be the masters of their own fate, they must, and here I return to Benjamin's dialectical image, sublate emancipatory philosophy into the Islamic tradition, not to remake the Islamic tradition, but rather to reinvigorate the prophetic class consciousness that determined the primordial Ummah, just as Ali Shariati did during the struggle to emancipate Iran from the American and Pahlavi domination. An abandonment of Islam will prove incapable of moving the Muslim masses towards social transformation. Returning to stale forms of religious fundamentalism will make the Muslim world anathema within the contours of modernity. A determinate negation of both into an emancipatory Islamic social theory must be generated.